Thank you very, very much. And also thank you to you for all of the work that you've put in on this conference. It's
Yeah,
been an amazing process.
thank you.
So thanks to the entire conference committee, the presenters who have joined us today and tomorrow, participants who are viewing the conference, and sponsors of the conference. We really appreciate your taking the time and the energy to support traditional medicine in its various forms. So anyone who needs to get a hold of me, Melinda_Connor, CONNOR @mindspring.com. Feel free to ask whatever questions you would like. If I have not responded inside of 48 hours, do not be shy. Go ahead and email me again. This work is a secondary study based on an earlier piece of work that we did. We actually did a series of studies beginning in 2004 and worked all the way through until we published in January, February Journal of Explore, the edition of Explore of 2021. While we were doing this series of studies in the original form, which is a empirical test of energy practitioners, we actually saw some really interesting anomalous results. It was fascinating. It was weird. It broke the rules of physics. So it made it particularly interesting. For those of you that have not been involved as deeply in the traditional aspects of medicine, energy healing is as old as herbal medicine. In fact, we have documentation going back about 60,000 years in various Aboriginal cultures around the world. So it's actually kind of interesting to see that process in action. The data that we were looking at was specifically water data. Now, water is fundamental in all of the processes that are involved, and it is critical to the body. Obviously, we're made most of water. And what we decided to do, since the data was so interesting and seemed to break the rules of physics, that we would go ahead and look at what the status was at this point and look much more specifically at this one particular test. What we did was we were looking at pH normalized water that had been exposed to a local environment for a period of 12 to 24 hours, if possible, even longer. And we looked at 65 naive participants. Now, let me qualify that. We did use professional practitioners, and we, in the US, we define energy healing practitioners as someone who is doing 6 paid healings per week for a minimum of 42 weeks a year. So these individuals were in active clinical practice that were participating, but had never tried to do this particular process, and it actually isn't commonly taught to practitioners in the US, even within the more ethnocentric processes. So we have a range of disciplines that were tested. We have a range of styles of practitioner that were tested in these various studies. In the US, we actually have defined 11 different disciplines within the energy community that are unique in terms of styles and methodology and underlying philosophies. So that's also important to pay attention to. This was a cross-divisional study of 65 participants. There were 24 men and 41 women. We had 29 practitioners, which did produce the results expected by normal physics. Now, when you look at normal physics, you expect pH to go ahead and go up when you have higher parts per million. Dissolved solids in the water itself actually cause the parts per million, the particle solids in the water to change. If you remove the various particulate matter, then the water actually becomes more and more acid. And it actually will go down to the 4.5 scale of wine. So if you're looking at it from a religious perspective as well, there is validation within that process. We used common meters that are available in the marketplace. We actually used glass mason jars that were very, very standard, used for canning here in the US. We used pH normalized water. We actually did the testing in a multiplicity of environments. The participants that were tested, each one had the same ppH meter and parts per million meter. So it was extremely important that we were consistent in the process. The meters were used in front of the practitioners. Practitioners could see the results of the meters when we actually did the check of that information. We did document each step of the way. So we would take the water, which had been conditioned to the local environment, confirm that it was still in the 6.8 to 7.0 range, so it was pH normal. Then we would go ahead and move that water into individual containers, which had been sterilized. At that point, the container was placed on an 8.5 by 11-inch sheet of paper in the center of the paper. Practitioners were then given instructions on what they could and could not do. They were allowed to place their hands on the glass of the container, but they could not place their hand over the glass. They could not cough or breathe or speak into the container of the water. They could keep the hands on the outsides of the paper as well, if they preferred to do that rather than touching the sides of the glass. Were instructed to utilize a rolling wave. And in the US, there are a number of television shows that have songs which are associated with them. One of them is a very old show called Rawhide, and we utilized a piece of that song to make the point. Rollin', rollin', rollin'. That was the type of wave we wanted practitioners to use. And again, this is not a commonly used waveform by practitioners who are not coming out of an ethno background. It's not generally taught in the energy healing training programs that are certificate programs in the US. At the point that they began the process, we did an initial check for parts per million, the dissolved solids that were in the actual water, and the pH, and that material was reported at that time. Now, in order to reduce the experimenter effects, we asked whichever experimenter was doing the review to stand a minimum of 12 to 18 feet away where everything could be observed, but hopefully there would be less field interaction and hopefully less experimenter effect during the actual testing processes. Because testing was done on quite a number of practitioners in different environments, the tests varied from a single individual to groups of 8. And it was dependent on that particular environment, what we had available. Practitioners who did make a mistake in terms of coughing or breathing into the water or moving their hand over the top of the water were immediately removed from the experiment and their data was dropped. We didn't have that happen often. It happened, I think, 2 or 3 times over the course of the testing. People just got involved in the process and had not listened well enough to the rules. So again, what normal science and normal physics would expect is that you would see a decrease in parts per million, the dissolved solids in the water, showing a decrease in pH, which means that the water has become more acidic, and an increase in pH with an increase in the dissolved solids. Now, this is pH normal water. So to get anything like that to change, you have to be affecting the physical structure of reality. I want that to sink in for just a moment. So this is a pH tester. It's a digital pH meter. They're commonly available on the market. A caveat to those that would like to do follow-up experiments, we invite people to do that, and we'll be happy to provide support for that process. Is that there are a number of these that are $20 versions which are on the market which do not function stably or accurately. Please be very careful. The actual testers that you purchase, test them out, make sure that they calibrate appropriately, the calibration is maintained, and that they continue to work accurately over time. The pH process is fairly standard. You utilize a buffering solution to establish the calibration. You only use glass to contain the water for this process. Again, we prefer 12 to 24. If we can do 48, we do it. We do not use distilled water. We use natural water. One of the things to be aware of, at least in the US, is many city water supplies actually do not have pH normal water. They are alkaline in general, so you do need to check and see. Historical information on this set of experiments. We actually, when we started these experiments back in 2004, we used pool strips from Walmart. So we did not actually change to digital meters until 2015 in terms of the development of the original set of experiments. You want to be careful to calibrate the device prior to each run. You don't want the device measurement section to contact the surface of the glass. Only test in glass. If you test in plastic, your data is going to be off because there's interaction with leaching of the chemicals from the plastics. You want to rinse the glass well, let it fully dry, preferably sterilize it if you have that facility to do so, because otherwise, when you test, you won't have pH normal material in the glass as you begin. One of the interesting things and anomalous things that I'd like to mention right now is that there was a subgroup of practitioners that actually had the water look like it was boiling. Now, it was temperature normal when we checked that, but it actually had the appearance of a rolling boil without utilizing a psychokinetic wave. So I share that as, again, interesting anomalous information. The TDS meter is a total dissolved solids meter. It's a parts per million meter. And one of the things that's interesting to note is this is actually a quantum measurement as it moves through the scale. So you're talking orders of magnitude. It's also important to note that the practitioners that did this were all above the error rates of any of these devices. All of them made changes past the error rates. So very important information. Some of the anomalous changes that we saw a decrease in pH with no change in the parts per million of the dissolved solids. We saw an increase in pH with no change in the parts per million. According to physics, that can't be done. We saw no change in pH with a decrease in parts per million and no change in pH with an increase in parts per million. We saw a split reaction, an increase in pH with a decrease in parts per million, and vice versa. We also saw something that really should not have happened at all, because all of the pH normal water have some dissolved solids in them. And one of the things we saw was a change in pH with a decrease in parts per million all the way to 0. And the same thing, both an increase and a decrease again in pH with a decrease in parts per million all the way to 0. There's no way that that could happen without someone at some level manipulating matter, unless the devices were wrong. And as I said, you need to check the calibration. You need to be very careful of that. It needs to be accurate. It needs to be confirmed in repetitive testing that the device is accurate. So this is a summary of the changes from the effects. And in particular, it's important to pay attention to the effect size that's involved in the study. This was only 65 people, so it's not the 1,000 plus that we tested in the original set of the experiments, but it is large enough to make the process interesting. And you can see in some of the cases, for example, where we saw pH go down and the parts per million go up, we had significance of a 0.0001. That's hugely significant data. In some of them, we didn't have a large enough sample size. For example, we only had an N of 1 in the stable form of the pH with a downward flow in the parts per million, so it's not enough data for us to get significance. We would like to go ahead and do some repeat trials, but we do want to make this information available. I mean, one of the questions out there is if healers can change the structure of water, is that part of the mechanisms of action in which they're engaged when they're working on a client? Hands-on or hands-off, that data is available. For those of you that are new to reviewing data on the energy healing community, on energy practitioners, the National Alliance of Energy Practitioners, naoep.org website has about halfway down the home page has a tab saying bibliographies. There are 15,000 peer-reviewed journaled articles that have links on that bibliographic database. So we do have an evidence base that is available on energy healing, but we're still working on the basics. You know, we're essentially, as a profession, and as a traditional medicine profession, we have a great deal of anecdotal information, but more research is clearly needed. Let's look at the parts per million, the level of alkalinity. And again, you see we have everything from 0.1 to a 0.0001. So we had significance within the community. We also had, again, numbers in some cases that were too small to gain significance. So replication trials are clearly needed. If you can change the pH of water, can you change the pH of blood? That's one of the questions that's out there. Blood is heavily buffered, but if in fact it turns out in subsequent studies that practitioners can change the pH of blood, that would be a significant finding. So for those of you that are interested in continuing on this particular process of research, we would be delighted to see that happen. Overall, we've got a 0.03 of significance in the process of change. It's pretty fascinating to see what can happen. with the practitioners involved. 86% of the practitioners placed their hands on the glass containers to make the shift. There was no specific correlation between anomalous changes and contact or non-contact with the containers. There was no specific correlation as to style of energy work that was being utilized for those that were able to make changes. There is a technique which is commonly being discussed within the scientific community doing research on energy practices, and it's called intention setting. That was not a technique which was used for this process. Intention setting in an esoteric form is actually a dimensional shift. In most cases, scientists today are talking about it as a push wave. That is a different process, but neither one was used by practitioners in this experiment. Instead, they utilized a rolling wave. So the data demonstrates that a percentage of energy practitioners produce changes in pH and parts per million, the total dissolved solid levels in water, that does not currently match our understood physics and material science. It's interesting and anomalous data. The IRB approval for this particular research was done through the National Foundation for Energy Healing, and I funded the studies out of my pocket. The original studies were funded through a whole series of grants, the Reconnection, Body Spirit Wisdom Foundation, National Institutes of Health underwrote some of the people that were involved in the science on the earlier studies. And we extend our thank you to all of those that were involved in that process as well.